Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have another returning guest, and this time it's Kathryn Weathersby. Kathryn is a visiting scholar at the US Korea Institute at the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University. She is also a fellow at the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies, as well as the director of the Korea Initiative of the Cold War International History Project at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And through these roles, she has tended to focus on some of the deeper, more fundamental aspects of Korean history as well as Cold War history. And that is what the topic of our previous podcast was about, which I'm going to link below. But today's discussion takes a slightly lighter look at things. The focus is less on warfare and conflict and more on diplomacy, economic development, and international showcases. And that's because today's topic is going to be the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the lead up to them, the events themselves, and the significant aftermath and success of the Games. Now, all Olympic Games are a long time in the building, and so too was Korea's, which began in the Park Chung-hee era. Park was hoping to showcase the economic development of his country, the rapid changes that had happened, and yet the secondary purpose, which we're going to focus on more directly here, was the diplomatic outreach to unaffiliated and communist countries in the world. Ever since the division of the two Koreas, both countries had been fighting for viability over who was the legitimate government of the country, of both Koreas. And in many ways this tended to split down Cold War lines, the capitalist world on one side and the socialist communist world on the other. But of course the Seoul Games in 1988 is one of those events that happens just as the Cold War is breaking up entirely. A lot of countries have already splintered away, the collapse is already happening in some respects, and the complete end to this polarized world was just around the corner. And so South Korea was trying to capitalize on where it was about to find itself in the world. It looked to Moscow and to satellite countries such as Hungary, saw the economic decline that they were in, recognized their needs, and reached out to them. And of course this same outreach was eventually spread to China as well. But across this scope of diplomacy, there is one fundamental problem here, and that is North Korea. Their original response to the Games was to ask to be part of themselves, to be a co-host. When this broke down, they responded with terrorism and the downing of Korean Air Flight 858. And when all this failed to initiate a boycott of the Games, they turned to pressure and intimidation, applying this directly to their allies in the world. And despite all of this, the Games were an overwhelming success, not just in the event itself, but more so in the diplomacy. The successful outreach that South Korea made, the binding ties that came from this and have lasted ever since, the changing way that South Korea repositioned themselves in the world, and the beginning of international isolation that has since surrounded North Korea. There is a lot in this podcast, and I'm going to leave the introduction here and let Kathryn get into the details herself. But this runs like a narrative, it runs like a story. It's so interesting at times. The twists and the turns, they're strange, they're terrifying, and they're also quite funny at times. It's one of those lesser focused on moments in Korean history, and yet one whose impact has long outlived itself and is still lasting today. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We don't run advertising in any way. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the links below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. All the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to talk us through the build-up to, the event itself, and the aftermath of the Seoul 1988 Olympics, this is Kathryn Weathersby. Kathryn Weathersby, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So it's great to have you back. And last time we spoke about the division of Korea, the Korean War, and this is where a lot of your research has focused in this really dark, deep part of history and this look into the old Cold War archives. But today's topic is going to be something slightly different with a slightly different tack. So I might yet introduce just where we're heading with this and why we're going here and why it's so important to talk about the Seoul Olympics in 1988.
Yes, well, this is a story I talk about in my classes, and I've also given some public talks about this. It's not based on my original research. I rely heavily on the work that Don Oberdorfer did, the wonderful journalist who's sadly no longer with us, but his book is so important to our understanding of Korea, his book, The Two Koreas. He interviewed key players in this drama and pulled together the information that I'm relying on, and in addition to background knowledge from my own research on the history of North Korea. So after I did a considerable amount of work on the war, I turned my attention to the history of North Korea post-war. And so this is such an important episode in that history. So I enjoy talking about it.
So let's begin to build this up, because this plays through like a narrative. It's really quite an interesting story, and it really has all these odd twists and turns that you can't quite see coming, and a remarkable ending to it all. So let's build this up with the first question, just to set the scene briefly before we touch on the Olympics. What does the political and the conflict kind of landscape look here between the two Koreas building up? So in our last podcast, which I'm going to link, we did touch on the Korean War and the division of Korea, but there's a big gap in the years there. So I know it's a tricky one, but just in a broad outline, what did that particular landscape in that particular period?
Yes, well, after the Korean War, neither side ever established diplomatic relations with the other, and this is still the situation. Seoul and Pyongyang do not recognize each other as legitimate governments. But also, then the close allies of both of them didn't recognize the other as a legitimate government. So the issue of diplomatic relations is very important. North Korea claims to be the sole legitimate government of Korea, and South Korea claims to be the sole legitimate government of Korea. And so when other states recognize one or the other of them, that's a big deal. It's important in their ongoing struggle with each other over who's going to prevail, who is ultimately going to be the government of Korea.
So let's jump into the Olympics itself and perhaps the decision to apply for them. So I believe this was Park Chung-hee who made the first step here, which of course is many years before the Olympics itself. And well, here's two primary reasons that you bring forward. And the first one, some people may understand, this one might be a little bit more common. This is to showcase the economic development of Korea.
Well, yeah, that's pretty obvious. Don Oberdorfer calls this Korea's coming out party. That's a kind of wonderful depiction of it. Yeah, that was very important. But the second one is more to the point, although both of them are really. The second reason, even all the way back in Park Chung-hee's time, was to try to use the Olympics to establish diplomatic relations with additional countries, both communist and non-aligned countries. So from the very beginning of the discussions in Seoul about making a bid for the Olympics, this was one of the goals.
So why was it so important to develop these relationships with these communist and non-aligned countries? Why was it so vitally important for South Korea to develop such attachments to these nations?
Well, diplomatic relations signals that the other country recognizes the legitimacy of the Republic of Korea. North Korea does not recognize that legitimacy. So in this ongoing political struggle, it's very important, and it's most important, of course, if countries close to North Korea would recognize South Korea. So either communist allies of the North or non-aligned countries that it was fairly close to, like Indonesia, for example. So both of these were important goals. And then, in a practical sense, if the ROK has diplomatic relations with these countries, then trade can flourish, diplomatic interaction in all sorts of political issues, movement of people and so forth. All of that is much easier as well.
So in this international battle for legitimacy between the two Koreas, as we're talking about, it sounds like a potential threat, or at least there's something that the North Koreans might be quite worried about. So as it's pinging through my ears here, I'm thinking, how explicit was South Korea about this intention? Was this something that they openly said, this is what we're trying to achieve? I mean, it sounds like a very complex, very hopeful kind of goal, and also something that might be quite threatening to the North Korean regime.
Well, yes, they weren't quite so open about it to the international community, but North Korea understood exactly what they were up to. So, as soon as Seoul won the rights to host the '88 Summer Olympics, there was a statement in the main newspaper in North Korea. If I can read it, shall I do that?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. It says, recently, South Korean military fascists have been mobilizing high-ranking officials and related staff of the puppet government. It's a lot of propaganda terms here. As well as pro-government trumpeters to raise a ridiculous hullabaloo every day about the Olympics, which are said to be going to be held in Seoul in 1988. Now the puppets of South Korea are approaching socialist nations and non-aligned countries in the hope of establishing diplomatic and official relations in order to have their, quote, state, end quote, recognized as a legitimate one. Yeah, so, Pyongyang was not fooled about the purpose of this.
That's a good little insight into what is going to be running through this sort of global competition and this end of the Cold War, but North Korea is still fighting very strongly for this idea of at least a global socialist competition against capitalism. And I suppose it touches on another question that we need to set the scene a little bit here. South Korea weren't the only country doing this. This was a time and place in the world where a lot of nations were reaching out to a lot of communist and former communist countries in the USSR, in the Soviet Union, of course, and but also in China.
Well, yes, that's true. And what was happening was that the isolation of the former communist bloc was weakening, partly because of financial need. Their economies were not doing well, and out of desperation to get loans, to get outright grants, to get technology transfer, all sorts of things, trade. They reached out to establish relations with non-communist countries, and which in turn were interested in making those relations in order to lessen the tension of the Cold War.
So let's move on to Kim Il-sung and his response to this. And I saw in your research the interesting photographs and the interesting lessons and the interesting speeches that were made about this. But when Kim Il-sung is looking for a response and he's concerned about this and he's looking for advice, he turns to Fidel Castro.
Yeah. I mean, Castro is such an amazing figure, right? Had held off the mighty United States for decades. Yeah, and so, they emphasize to the North Korean leadership that this is a serious political issue. It says it's not merely an athletic issue, but an important political question touching on the basic interest of world revolution, of whether the attraction of socialism or capitalism will be strengthened on the Korean Peninsula. So, that's what the Olympics is all about, from the point of view of the communist bloc, at least some of them. That's a quote directly from the East German Party, actually. So they're cautioning, not cautioning really, but supporting Pyongyang in thinking that this is politically really important.
And Fidel Castro's advice to Kim Il-sung is something that, in some case, this is an odd little moment for me. It sounds like his advice is something that South Korea wouldn't go for. His advice is to co-host the Olympic Games, to offer to co-host them. And in some ways, this would clash with those first two ideas that South Korea had. It would limit their ability to showcase their economic power, and it also would limit their diplomatic outreach. But this is something that South Korea are remarkably open to, at least in terms of discussions and negotiations.
Well, I think what they were doing was stalling. I don't think they were really open to this possibility. They engaged in negotiations with the North, a triangular negotiation with the IOC, International Olympic Committee. But I don't think they were really serious about it. It was a way to sort of manage North Korea's opposition to it, hoping to buy some time to, I don't know, for it to somehow work out in some way that was going to be okay for them. But in the end, of course, it did not. The IOC eventually decided to hold all the events in the South. This was in 87, so the year before the Olympics. And so when that final decision was reached, then the North took quite extraordinary action.
So let's move into that extraordinary action. Actually.
Yeah.
It might be a good moment. And this is something that many people may have heard about, though not in detail. It is an odd and called a catastrophic moment in history here. So they moved from diplomacy and this failed outreach to outright terrorism with the attack on Korean Air Flight 858. So this is one of those moments in history people have a touch on, but it really is. This happens a year before the Olympic Games, I believe.
Right. But the very next month after the decision, or 2 months actually, after this decision had been made, final decision by the IOC, that all the events would be held in Seoul. Well, an indication of just how threatened North Korea felt about Seoul hosting the Olympics is that they took this extraordinary action to try to spoil it, to try to persuade people that it was too dangerous to go to Seoul. So the way they did that was to dispatch 2 agents, very highly trained special agents, to board a flight, a Korean Air flight, returning to Seoul from the Middle East. It left from Abu Dhabi. They first boarded it in another city, and then when it got to Abu Dhabi, they got off the plane having left a bomb in the overhead compartment, timed bomb. So they were still in the airport in Abu Dhabi when the bomb went off. The airplane exploded over the Indian Ocean. To the credit of airport authorities, they acted very quickly to identify who might have set that bomb. And so they zeroed in on these 2 people, an older man and a young woman who were traveling under Japanese passports that they suspected might be fake. And so they took them into custody. These were the two North Korean agents. They had been instructed and trained to bite a cigarette if they were apprehended, bite a cigarette that was in their pocket that had cyanide in the tip, in the filter tip, so that they would die immediately and couldn't reveal anything about the plot. So the older man did that and did die very quickly there in the airport. But the younger woman started to do that, put the cigarette to her mouth, and amazingly, the airport security guard who was watching over her understood somehow what she was doing and knocked the cigarette out of her hand. So she did not die. And she was then taken to Seoul by South Korean forces that arrived to deal with her. And then things become, really quite interesting. She maintained the pose through interrogations for quite some time, that she was Japanese, that she was traveling with this other man, But then the South Korean secret police who were responsible for her and were carrying out the interrogations did something very wise. They decided to take her on a walkabout around Seoul to show her what conditions were actually like in the South, knowing that her idea, shaped by North Korean propaganda, was that the people of the South were desperately poor and oppressed by the so-called puppet government, and they were waiting for the North to come rescue them. So she went on this walk, heavily guarded, of course. And afterwards, she spoke in Korean for the first time, saying, "Forgive me, I will tell you everything." Was amazing. And so she explained that she did this mission because she thought it was going to help liberate her fellow Koreans in the South.
That is such a remarkable story that it's one of those things that not just touches on, I suppose, the conflict between the two countries, but the ideology between the two countries. Because I was reading through that as well in preparation for this, and her language is exactly what you said. It's I was doing this in the hope of reunifying my country. It's really deep in, and this touches on one of the important questions here. I'll just one last question on that before we move on, and that is, she is sentenced to death inside South Korea, and then her sentence is commuted by No Tae-woo, and he does so on the grounds that she was brainwashed. It's this very interesting question between South Korea and North Korea, and in some ways still this battle for legitimacy about who was the right government here.
Yeah, exactly. And her case is so tragic, She continued to live in the South. She became a Christian, that probably helped. Dealing with issues of guilt, I don't know. It's hard to imagine, being responsible for the deaths of 115 people on the plane.
And living out her days in protection,
exactly.
Apparently not just from North Korean agents coming down to kill her, but from angry South Koreans who may want some kind of vengeance. It was a strained, horrible kind of life to live out. But so from that, we should touch on just the intentions here. So the intentions here was to, as you mentioned, dissuade people from going to Olympic Games.
Right.
How successful was this attack itself? Because this comes at a time when they may have had reason to think, the North Koreans, that this may actually work. This was a time where boycotts of Olympic Games was actually on the cards. The previous Olympic Games that had happened, the US had sat out the games in Moscow, and then the LA Games following that, the Soviet bloc sat out them. So let's touch on that big picture here, this idea of these two ends of Olympic boycotts.
Yes, well, partially because of that, the Soviet bloc really had no interest in boycotting these Olympics. They wanted to go, right? The previous two Olympics had been disrupted by major boycotts. No one wanted to do that, not just the communist bloc, but other countries around the world. So instead, what happened was the Soviets moved in to secure the situation vis-a-vis the North and make sure that the North was not going to be able to engage in any more terrorism. And they assured the United States that they had the situation under control. We don't have details about that. That will be amazing when we finally learn exactly what they did, how they managed to guarantee that. But they were successful. They were quite furious with the North for doing this. So this did not work at all. In fact, the 1988 Olympics were the biggest ever in terms of the number of countries that participated. It was huge. So that North Korean action just absolutely failed.
So why were the Soviet Union so upset at this time? Because, as I said, the previous couple of games had been boycotted by either side in this, and this is still a Cold War period. And yet this is Gorbachev abandoning his Cold War ally in a way and choosing to join the international community on the other side. So why were they so rejected by the Soviet Union?
Well, this was still the Cold War, but Gorbachev was moving quite clearly in a new direction. Just at the end of 1988, at the UN, he made a major speech. So just a couple of months after the Olympics, made a major speech declaring a completely new approach to foreign relations. That all countries are interdependent. We can no longer talk about a closed society. We all have to coexist in peace, all of these things. Meanwhile, he was trying to make very substantial and fundamental reforms in the Soviet economy. So he had turned a page. So he was no longer interested. His mindset was such that he was not going to support this obstreperous ally in North Korea. He was going a new direction.
So let's step forward from there into a term that's going to run through a lot of this, and it's Nordpolitik. Now, some people have heard this. I read it still in North Korea and in South Korean newspapers about the new Nordpolitik everyone talks about. So, what is this term, and what exactly does it mean?
Well, it's policy, and it's taken from the term that West Germany used in the 70s, Ostpolitik, East policy. This was the policy of improving relations with East Germany by improving relations with East Germany's allies, mainly the Soviet Union, but also others in Eastern Europe. So by the 1980s, the South Korean leadership wanted to try the same approach. So they called it Nordpolitik after the German word. So their idea was they couldn't directly approach North Korea, but they would try to improve the situation by establishing relations with North Korea's allies in Eastern Europe first, and then hopefully in the Soviet Union, so that establishing those relations would both put pressure on and encourage North Korea to moderate its actions, its views. That was the idea. The focus first was Hungary. And that's quite interesting because Hungary was a very developed part of the communist bloc. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been wealthy and highly developed part of Europe. But by the 1980s, Hungary was in desperate economic straits, as were other East European Soviet bloc countries. But in Hungary, it was particularly severe because they had borrowed a lot of money following Ostpolitik. Had borrowed a lot of money from Western Europe, especially West Germany, and in a desperate effort to modernize their economy so that they could survive. Those efforts were not successful, and they just kept getting further and further in debt. So they were really badly in need of money, but they were also forward-looking, progressive, we might say. By 1988, the leadership was interested in trying new approaches. So Hungary was a promising focus, and that's where the South directed its efforts initially. They sent the Daewoo chairman to Budapest to do these negotiations. They were really tough negotiations, right? Seoul made it clear that before they were going to extend any loans and credits, Hungary had to agree to establish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Korea. That was absolutely the condition. Finally, after really hard bargaining, they did make an agreement. It was announced the day before the Olympics began. So immediately before the Olympics. So when the Hungarian team marched in to the stadium in that opening parade of athletes, the Korean spectators went crazy with cheers. Yeah, it was clear what was happening.
What was the North Korean response to all this? Because I was reading, again, you've had a couple of wonderful quotes from the North Korean propaganda, and I was reading through some of your quotes here as well that you'd found, and they are horribly dismissive of the Hungarians here. They talk about this treacherous, grave act and of the Hungarians begging and them being cash strapped. So just what exactly is this North Korean response?
Yeah. Again, the newspaper said Hungary had committed a treacherous, grave act against the principles of Marxism, Leninism, and the revolutionary cause of the working class. And then it asked, is Hungary so strapped that it has no choice but to beg for a few dollars, even from the South Korean puppets, breaching faith with a friend to survive? Yeah. And so the answer to that question is yes. Yeah, it was pretty strong language.
Yes. And so from Hungary, and of course this is the day before the Olympics, so this is all agreed. As the Olympics turns around, Seoul's attention is increasingly turned towards Moscow, which I suppose is the big one here, one of the big diplomatic relationships that they want to achieve. And again, they are asking for diplomatic ties with Moscow.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that the South was so energetic about this. I mean, they were really very bold and aggressive in pursuing the Soviets. So already in the summer of '88, before the Olympics, then the main official responsible for Nordpolitik went to Moscow to deliver a letter from Noteu to Gorbachev, calling for diplomatic relations as a step toward peace and stability in Asia. They knew Gorbachev would be interested in that. The Soviets were not yet ready to say they would make diplomatic relations, but they did say they could move to improve their unofficial ties. And so that's what they proceeded to do then. They made quite a big cultural effort just before the Olympics, sending the Bolshoi Ballet and Moscow Philharmonic Orchestra to Seoul for performances. But then the really big turning point was the Olympics themselves, because a huge Soviet delegation went. The Soviets usually sent gigantic delegations, but this was no exception. They all stayed on a ship in Incheon Harbor. They had to, still Soviet Union, so that they had to be monitored, by their own KGB people. So keeping them on a ship made it easier to do that. The South lavished gifts on them, the latest computers to use for writing up their reports. They gave them buses to use to go between the harbor and all the venues for the Olympics, all kinds of things like that. So it was very, very elaborate courting of the Soviets, and it was quite successful. I have some quotes here.
Yes, please do. I know where you're heading. These are really interesting insights into just how successful this.
The Soviet Press Corps, the head of the Soviet Press Corps, who later became Gorbachev's press secretary, said, after being in Seoul for a bit, everything I had read before turned out to be outdated. I arrived into the 21st century. Right? And then the editor of Aganyok magazine, a leading magazine, said, my vision of South Korea as a third world country disappeared. And then Pravda, the Communist Party newspaper, the most sober of all of them, said, The sports facilities in Seoul are the best in the world, and the values of Korean traditional smile and etiquette have been greatly underestimated.
It's a remarkable insight there. I mean, these are
Yeah.
adversaries. These are Cold War adversaries, and one is
Oh,
lavish and not just saying the other one has achieved good things, but it's saying I was completely I completely misunderstood the other side in this.
yeah, yeah. And I arrived into the 21st century. That one just is amazing.
Yes.
One of Gorbachev's aides who came to Seoul with the group told Gorbachev, there is definitely no other place on earth where people so heartily welcome the Soviets. So that's, of course, paving the way, right?
Well, let's touch on that moment about welcoming the Soviets, because you mentioned it just before, and it feels to me, looking back on this, of course, I don't remember this, but it feels like almost a precipitous end of the Cold War that people maybe looking back would recognize that the end of the Cold War was here in this moment. And you touched on it there when the Hungarians walk into the stadium at the opening ceremony and the Koreans explode in cheers. But you also mentioned that when the Soviet athletes entered from other countries, they were all greeted with such wild cheers as well. And you mentioned this very interesting thought of the Americans in the stadium being incredibly disconcerted by this and shocked that their great capitalist allies welcome the other side in this way. It's this wonderful little dichotomy there. And of course, on the other side of this, there's complete absence of North Korea. They don't send anyone at all, and there's no coverage inside.
That's right. There was a basketball game, if I'm remembering correctly, between the Soviet team and the American team. And at that game, the Korean spectators were cheering for the Soviets. and the Americans were sort of, what is this? They were very confused about that. It is a huge moment, not only for Korea, but for the Cold War as a whole. Yeah, it absolutely was. And so the coverage, of course, the Olympics go on for a long time, the Summer Olympics especially, and the coverage tends to be, wall to wall. And it was then. So everybody in the Soviet Union all day long were looking at their television at scenes of Seoul, this very impressive modern capital where people are being just so gracious and charming and welcoming.
And the overall success of the outreach was also important here, because you put this stat here that there are 167 IOC countries and 160 send delegations to the Olympics. 24 of these had no diplomatic relationship with Seoul whatsoever.
Yes, yeah. So it was just a huge, huge success. And of course, the Olympics themselves went very smoothly. There were no incidents whatsoever, any kind of security breaches. It was a grand success. Immediately afterwards then, Gorbachev started preparing this important speech for the UN, declaring that all countries are interdependent. We must resolve our conflicts through cooperation. Huge turning point.
Let's touch on that speech, because that is really one of those moments here. So this is called, I believe it's called the New Thinking speech, when he goes to it before. And he, as you mentioned there, this is so important because it really shows you how close we are to the end of this, not the story we're talking about, but the Cold War, because he says how interdependent all these countries are. But also, in a sense, he is saying that the Cold War and those old Cold War divides, they no longer make sense anymore.
Yes, exactly. I think it's really legitimate to date the end of the Cold War to December 1988, his speech at the UN. Because basically the Cold War ended because one side changed their mind, right? That side was the Soviet Union. When the Soviet leadership decided to no longer pursue that conflict, the whole thing was over. And then the very next year, of course, this incredible year of 1989, all of the East European Soviet bloc countries abandoned their communist governments, and Moscow did nothing to try to stop that.
So that Let's press into that moment a little bit, because in that same year, 1988, on November 10, there's a meeting of the Politburo back inside the Soviet Union. And the deputy prime minister for foreign economic ties and talks, and he says, I suppose something quite prescient about how not just the Cold War is coming to an end, and not just the success of capitalism, but also the dire economic straits that the communist countries are finding themselves in. And he has these quotes, and he talks about South Korea being the most promising partner in the Far East. And this another one. This is really quite interesting. Unless we undertake to normalize relationships with South Korea, we may be too late. So it talks to a terrifying fear inside these countries that the capitalist world is moving forward and they're being left behind.
Yeah, yeah. There was a tremendous sense of urgency within the Gorbachev government to do something to solve their immediate economic problems, or else they would, lose everything. The people would give up on them. So yeah, there was a great sense of urgency. I should add at this point, because people might be wondering, what about Japan? Japan had a bigger economy, of course. So why didn't the Soviets turn to Japan? The reason is that following World War II, the Soviet Union and Japan never reached a peace treaty. And so their relations have been severely strained ever since then. There's a territorial dispute over the southern part of the Kuril Islands that the Soviets took, and Japan considers their territories. But because of that diplomatic impasse, they could not turn to Japan for economic help. And so South Korea then was the available partner.
So let's talk about North Korea, who are the other side of this, who have watched countries like Hungary being slowly pulled away from them towards a South Korean orbit. And now they're watching Moscow. And this is not just any other state for them. This is the state that created their state, that divided the country, and has supported them ever since. So how do North Korea begin to see all this?
Well, I mean, they're furious, right? Let's see. De Brennan went to Seoul in May of 1990. The instruction from Gorbachev before his trip to Seoul was, we need some money. That's a good one. We need some money. And he should explore the possibility of a loan and a outright grant from South Korea. And so No Tae-woo informed De Brennan that he was open to this under the condition that they establish full diplomatic relations. And so then in June of 1990, the two leaders met in San Francisco. They had both been to the UN for a meeting, and they were on their way back. So that's why they were there. So at that meeting, June of 1990, No announced that they were ready to give a major credit, extended major credit to the Soviet Union to purchase South Korean products. I can give a quote here from this press conference. Said the road between Seoul and Pyongyang is now totally blocked. Accordingly, we have to choose an alternative route to North Korea by way of Moscow and Beijing. This may not be the most direct route, but we certainly hope it will be an effective one. So that's, the basic idea behind Nordpolitik. So here we have an agreement between No Tae-woo and Gorbachev, June 1990, to establish ties. And so it's at that point then that North Korea makes their response. Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, was tasked with going to Pyongyang to inform the North Koreans. He later described this as the worst event of his life.
Yes.
Oh my. So he met with his counterpart in North Korea, the foreign minister, who said such an action, meaning, Soviet Union establishing diplomatic relations with Seoul, would give international legitimacy to the permanent division of Korea. and then would be fundamentally different from and more serious than that by other nations, because the Soviet Union, along with the US, had been responsible for the division of the country, and because the Soviet Union had been the first to recognize the DPRK as the sole legitimate state in Korea. You see them making this kind of formal, case here. And then the foreign minister also said this would embolden South Korea to try harder to destroy socialism in the North and swallow it up along the lines of the East German scenario. This is 1990, so already what happened to East Germany was known, was absorbed by West Germany. Then it says then it starts making threats. If Moscow recognized another part of Korea as legitimate, Pyongyang would be free to recognize other parts of the Soviet Union. Because at that point, Gorbachev was faced not only with economic crisis, but with the crisis of several of the republics openly declaring independence, that they want to leave the Soviet Union and become independent. Lithuania was one of the leaders of it. So Pyongyang is saying, you recognize Seoul, we'll recognize Lithuania.
It's an interesting threat, that, because I've been reading through it myself. It really is an open threat, and it touches not just on North Korean insecurity here, but perhaps on a misunderstanding of the precarious situation that Moscow are in too. Because I suppose we haven't touched on it, and we should here, just how much of an economic drain North Korea were being at this time on Moscow and throughout these years. And of course, this is a country that's desperately running out of money and needing to improve its economic situation. But North Korea, ever since its inception and for a long time running since, has just been running up bigger and bigger debts with the Soviet Union and not repaying them.
Absolutely. And with China as well. It couldn't have existed without constant aid from Soviet Union and China. By this time, the Soviets were sending 1.9 billion a year to the North and receiving about 0.9 billion, about half that much, in payment. So they were only getting paid for about half of what they were sending to the North. And so as they're faced with such a serious economic crisis, they simply didn't want to keep subsidizing this troublesome state in Korea. Yeah.
And this steps forward just a touch. So I believe it was the foreign delegate there who said, "This is the most unpleasant experience of my life." I'm going to mispronounce it. Shredrenez. And
yeah.
Yes, he goes. Of course, this agreement with Seoul is eventually ironed out, and they agree to have diplomatic relations for a large loan package. And this is really quite an interesting moment. It shows you just how detached and disenchanted Soviet Union had become with North Korea. When he signs it, he turns to his aides and whispers under his breath, "That will take care of our friends."
Yeah, he was just so furious. These threats from North Korea, after propping them up all of these decades, for North Korea to turn around and threaten the Soviet Union was just too much for Shevardnadze. Yeah. So, he moved up the announcement of the formal diplomatic recognition by a couple of months, up to September 1990, and said to his aides, "Well, that'll take care of our friends." So the North Korean response to this announcement was the Soviet Union sold off the dignity and honor of a socialist power and the interest and faith of an ally for $2.3 billion. Yeah, well, that's pretty much what it was, actually. So they were very clear-eyed about what was going on here and hoping to just shame the Soviets, but that didn't work.
And one of the important parts of Kim Jong-nam, the foreign minister of North Korea who makes that original response. And the last the last pillar of his response is he says they will no longer be bound by pledges not to develop certain weapons.
Yeah.
And of course, he's talking about nuclear weapons here.
Yeah, yeah. So they're not only threatening to recognize the independence of some of the republics of the Soviet Union, but they're also threatening to make their own nuclear weapons. Yeah.
And let's move to this moment, because, of course, for many people listening, people with economic minds, which I don't really have myself, but they must be thinking of this moment in history and this moment when Seoul had given this large loan out to the Soviet Union and to Moscow. And they must realize that just around the corner is the complete economic collapse of the Soviet Union as well. So this final agreement, which is paid out, is quite a large agreement. It must come right before the Soviet Union collapses. So is this loan ever repaid?
Only in part. The Russian government that took over after the collapse of the Soviet Union really couldn't pay off the entire amount. They were in desperate straits themselves. So, yeah, only some of it has been paid back.
And you mentioned, I heard you speaking about this, and you mentioned your own personal story, and this might give a good insight into just how successful South Korea were here in some ways. You mentioned, I'll get you to do it, of course, but you mentioned your time at this time in Moscow, in the streets, looking at billboards and products, and they're all South Korean.
Yeah, well, I arrived in Moscow just 2 weeks after the coup against Gorbachev, when the Communist Party had been made illegal by Yeltsin. Gorbachev had returned to Moscow. He and Yeltsin were struggling for control. But now the communist government is no longer. The Soviet Union had not yet dissolved, but the communist government was gone. And so as I drove into the city from the airport, I noticed all these billboards. I mean, that was first unusual. There weren't billboards in the Soviet Union since there wasn't private business. And then all these billboards were for Daewoo and Samsung. Oh, that's odd, right? Not knowing the history that was going on around me. So, and then as I just sort of did my daily life in the city looking for things, it was pretty hard to get whatever you needed. I noticed that there were lots of South Korean products in the stores, especially consumer electronics. Yeah, you saw a lot of them. It was a major presence. It was obvious.
And if that speaks to the success of South Korea, North Korea at this moment must be in absolute crisis mode. And from the behavior, from the international outreach, they appear to be just that. So this is really quite interesting. Kim Il-sung, you write, turns to China for help, and the Chinese reject him. This is after Moscow have turned their backs already. And following that, just how desperate he is to find a counterbalance, he turns to Japan and also to America.
Yeah, anybody, but was not successful. Yeah. And then the real disaster happened, which is that Moscow, first of all, shut off the military aid. This was something that Seoul had made a condition. Naturally enough, they weren't going to give all this money to the Soviets if the Soviets were going to turn around and deliver it to North Korea in the form of weapons. So their military aid had to stop. But in addition to that, because the Soviets were so angry at the North Korean response, they informed Pyongyang that they would have, if they wanted to get Soviet oil, which had been the source of oil for them, they would have to start paying world market prices in hard currency. Oh. Yeah, that was really a disaster, and they simply could not do that. Also, the lack of the military aid meant that they couldn't turn around and sell that military hardware to third world countries, which they had been doing for decades. The Soviets had allowed them to do this. It was a kind concession. That was a way for them to get hard currency. So they couldn't do that anymore. They weren't getting military supplies. So it was just an incredible disaster. China starts trading with South Korea, right, instead of with the North. Yeah.
Now that is a very important moment here, because these are two countries that seem to find exactly what they need in each other. This is really quite interesting, just as this is all coming to an end. So China as they increase their trade with South Korea, they realize that South Korea want, of course, the improvement of diplomatic relations. And what China wants as a response to this is the break from Seoul with Taiwan. And of course, they both achieve this by some sort of agreement.
Yep, there's lots of deal making going on here. China wants South Korea to end its formal relations with Taiwan, and so South Korea does in exchange for opening up trade with China. Yeah.
So let's touch on a couple of wonderful last moments in this, because this is really quite interesting. So how do you look back on this? For me, looking back on this research, and of course I'm nowhere near as touched onto it as you are, it seems like such a remarkable moment for South Korea, such a remarkable success. If someone today was to say, we're going to bid for the Olympic Games because we hope it's going to be this wonderful both economic and diplomatic success, they'd be laughed at. It seems to not be both. But for South Korea, this seems to have been such an extraordinarily significant diplomatic result from the Olympic Games.
Well, it really was, and it changed the entire position of South Korea, because now it's opening up to China as well as to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union then fell apart very quickly afterwards, and there wasn't much trade, wasn't much interaction with Russia for a while. Russia's come back partly, but the opening to China was, of course, key for South Korea. As well as its increased visibility around the world. But it's not an unmixed record, because the cutoff of aid from the Soviet Union led to the collapse of the North's economy. And that was not, and following that, then the terrible famine of the late 90s. And certainly the South didn't want the people in the North to starve. That was not what they were after. But that was a consequence. And the South then had to move in and try to provide aid directly to the North to mitigate the terrible suffering. Also, it hasn't led the North to be more conciliatory towards the South. Yeah. They survived the famine.
And beyond surviving the famine, I mean, that is one of the interesting things here. This is all building up to the complete collapse of North Korea. But many people, when they think about the Olympics in Korea, they think about the more recent 2018 Olympics, Winter Olympics in Pyongyang. And of course, this is a fascinating moment. So I might get you, could be a very good last question as well. I wonder how you saw that Olympic Games, because for people who may have forgotten, this is when South Korea hosted the Winter Olympics, and they had these, and North Korea attended, and they had joint teams in things like ice hockey, and there was this big outreach about reunification. And on an extra note, just on that, the current talk in South Korea, at least from Moon Jae-in and his government, is of jointly hosting the 2032. I mean, of course, they haven't won it yet, but 2032 Olympic Games with North Korea. So this Olympic diplomacy has a very recent history as well, and one that at least people are looking towards in the future. So how do you see those two Olympic Games in the light of all of this?
Well, one thing that struck me watching the Winter Games is that it was no longer a big deal for everyone to see how developed South Korea is. Everybody's now buying Samsung phones, and Samsung televisions. It's not news that North Korea's economy is quite advanced. So that's interesting. The joint teams with the North, well, better than blowing up airplanes.
Yes.
But it didn't really lead to anything concrete. So we're still in a situation of these sort of symbolic gestures, but nothing serious changing in the wake of them.
On that terrorist moment, though, I mean, that was interesting. I live in South Korea, and I remember the build up to those games, people being worried because, of course, there's a lot of nuclear tests and missile tests right before it. Yeah. So I wonder if you see this almost as a form of blackmailing or bribery or hostage taking, as in, let us in or we can do horrible things. I mean, that wasn't quite the intention from back in 1988, but it feels like it may have been the intention in 2018.
Yeah, well, I think you're right about that. Yeah. It gives the North quite a lot of leverage to have such destructive capability. Yeah.
And on a very last point here, this is quite a predictive one, but this is tricky. How successful do you think the 2032 joint bid is going to be between the two countries?
Oh, that just seems incredibly difficult to pull off. I can't imagine logistically doing that. Who knows? But the North would have to change so many things about how it does business to manage that, to bring that many people there. But who knows? I don't know. Things are changing pretty rapidly in the North. The marketization of the economy has proceeded with remarkable speed. So in another 10 years, perhaps they can pull it off. I just don't know. But the nuclear issue looms over everything. So that also may provide such a political obstacle that other countries are just not going to cooperate with North Korea to that level. We'll see. I mean, the wonderful thing about this story of 88, 89, 90 is how surprising it all was, how unpredictable it was. So that's the most hopeful thing to me about looking at this. Things can change. They can change quickly.
So that is a good note to leave this on. The research for this that I did, I'm going to link below the podcast as well as the link to the previous podcast that I did with Kathryn on the division of Korea and the Korean War. I encourage people to go look at both research and the previous podcast themselves. It is really quite interesting. And on that, Kathryn Weathersby, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Hope we have you back in the future at some point.
Thanks very much.